So just about to jump into the studio to record with Sarah Burke on the launch of the Women in Media Network. Full disclosure, I'm an advisor to the Women in Media Network. Thought you should know that. All right, let's go.
The Sound Off Podcast. The show about podcast and broadcast. Starts now.
Welcome back.
How are you today, Matt?
It's good. It was 9:58 between our first and second recordings and about 1,083 between recording 2 and 3.
Oh, wow.
So here we are today.
I didn't realize I've been on twice before. I thought just once.
I kind of had you on for a bonus episode, but then I left it in there. But it still says bonus episode. and we did it actually when you were launching your podcast, Women in Media.
So we're coming up on 2 years.
Yeah, actually longer. It's been 3 because, yeah.
Holy.
Where did that time go? But I want to roll it back even further than that to 2018 because you were at SiriusXM and then 2021, 22, you weren't anymore. So you made a departure. What have you been doing since that departure?
Bothering Matt Cundill as many times a day as my phone permits. And it's really bad when you see Do Not Disturb on. I'm kidding. It's funny that you are asking this question to begin because I was reflecting on a journal entry that I wrote around March 2022. So we're coming up on 2 years since this entry. And at that point, I was using my podcast as a way to display my skills. And I was like, I'm going to get hired at the next great job because of the skills that I will showcase on my podcast. And then I realized that that wasn't what I was trying to do at all. There's a little more of a purpose now. And I'm about to launch a podcast network.
It's funny how that works out. You always think, I'm going to start a podcast. I'll get the skills needed, and it will take me to this next fantastic job for one of these companies that clearly is going to be investing in podcasting. And it never happens. You wind up just doing it yourself. Me, for instance, but now you. So let me ask you, what's the name of the podcast network? How do we get on the network, and what's it all about?
Okay, now, don't be shocked at how creative I am, but it's called the Women in Media Podcast Network. And I would say it's born out of the same thing as my podcast, which was my experience as a woman in media, but also a new landscape in media where I think you and I are very aligned on this, where I think that content creators need to have more ownership and purpose with their own content. And a lot of the podcast networks out there, you know, they want to split things 50-50 down the middle with you. And I don't think either of us are trying to do that. We are trying to empower creators to do things themselves with some advice about the best ways to do it.
So one of the things that comes up a lot on this show is 3 years to build an audience, 3 years to find yourself. It's in radio too. 3 years for the radio station to become a heritage piece. 3 years for your morning show to really take off and become established. And here you are 3 years into the Women in Media podcast. Episodes have been coming out every 2 weeks. Very consistent on that stuff. I see you, I think, take summers off every once in a while. But yeah, congratulations to that. So what has the podcast journey been like to get you to this point where now you're starting a network?
Yeah. Oh, there's so many responses to this question. I think the way that I once thought about podcasting was quite narrow compared to the way I think of podcasting today. And I have to give Matt a ton of credit because a lot of my opinions about podcasting have been informed by things that we've worked on together. And I thank you for always like sharing the good, the bad, and the ugly along the way and during the process, because that has informed a lot of my opinion where we sit today in 2024. At one point, I was thinking about super serving Canadians, and that is like the silliest idea ever.
Whatever makes you think that way.
If you want to make it big in podcasting, you're podcasting to an audience that lives anywhere they can listen on an app.
Yeah. And you and I had that conversation, I think, when we were in Denver. We went down to Podcast Movement. The rest of the country always says that, you know, Toronto's the center of the universe. And it's very easy to feel that way when you work in media in Canada. But then here you are, you need to sort of leave that bubble, and you're now in a global playground. Yeah. Tell me about Podcast Movement. What'd you learn there?
Oh, my God. That was like one of the most eye-opening points in podcasting for me. I'm so glad that you said, hey, you should really think of going to that this year. You see all the different perspectives, right? What I used to think of as one perspective, like podcasting being very one-dimensional, like putting audio out, all you really need is the host and the editing. Now I can almost see it as the different departments of what we would compare to a radio station, right? There's your monetization and your metrics. There is chase production. There is, what's your marketing strategy? There's so many things to consider. And at Podcast Movement, you could participate in learnings about all those different things and come up with your kind of best, the way that it'll be best for you to do it as a podcaster. That's another thing. There's no wrong answer. There's many different ways to podcast. So finding out what works best for you is a huge part of it too. Don't you agree?
I do, which leads me to the next question, which is what have you needed to unlearn from radio in order to do the podcast thing?
Well, I always think about Cat and Nat and what they've been doing. We learned that throwing together a podcast in a vehicle, although not the best audio experience, can still build a great audience. And I know you and I are nerds where we want our audio to be the best, but I think one thing I unlearned was the power of a loyal audience, and an audience that is not determined by results that come in a ratings book. You have real-time stats when you want to look at how your latest episode did, or your monthly downloads, or audience engagement, consumption rates. You can look it all up in 2 seconds, and you don't have to answer to anyone to do that. You have your data.
So you've been very amiable to change, by the way, because you can hear it in the Women in Media podcast. You started off, I'm going to be interviewing a lot of women in media. And then some purpose begins to come into it. And I think a lot of that had to do with timing. So just for fun, I went and checked your biggest episodes of your podcast since you started. Okay. Do you know which ones they are?
Oh, I'm going to guess that Jen Valentine is still pretty up there.
Number 1 and number 3.
Okay, so who's in between? Josie Dye?
Maureen Holloway.
Maureen and Wendy. I had them together.
Right. Okay, great. But if there is something that sort of strings those 3 together, and that's who they worked with at Q107, and the story. I'm going to talk about this because these are the big downloads, and this is the big issue. And your podcast found a lot of purpose, especially bringing Jen Valentine on and others to tell their stories of women in media. And here you are, you're about to pivot and start a network. So how much is the podcast and what you've talked about in that podcast led to the network?
Yeah, well, they literally led to one another, and they have back and forth communication, really, because I think that, I will never stop wanting to allow women to tell their stories. But now there's a lot of different types of women telling their stories, and the definition of media has changed a lot. I think that's a big part of this. What I originally considered my guest, call it wish list, was TV, sports, radio at the beginning. Now I sort of think anyone who has a public profile doing something, whether it's real estate or cannabis education, you can be on the Women in Media podcast to talk about your experience in the spotlight as a woman, in your own spotlight. So yeah, I've branched out to thinking about how we define media, and that's where I'll continue to tell those stories on my podcast. But what's even more exciting is that there are a lot of women who want to tell their own stories and other women's stories, and that's where we're going to grow all together in a little community. I don't think it's going to be very little, to be honest, but...
So what's it going to take to become part of the network? What are you looking for? What are you attracted to most? And because I know people are sitting here going, oh, I have to apply for that.
This is not like me auditioning for my arts public school situation where, and then if you don't get cast in the school play, it's not like that. There's different tiers. And, for some people, it's just going to be, hey, I want to understand my data more, and I want to be hosted in a place with all of these people who I respect and admire, and participate in community and resource sharing with them. So the lowest tier is just about hosting. A lot of people will have their own producer or produce themselves. Even when you and I first talked, I was like, I don't need you producing. I want to produce myself. And that's something to consider, especially about women in this day and age. A lot of self-starters are out there who want to do their own things and be close to their own content that way. So, consistency is a lesson that I've really learned a lot about as both a podcaster and a producer in the last few years. I think you and I would share that lesson. Consistency is probably going to be the biggest thing. And my boss at SiriusXM, back when I was with the company, used to say like, oh, everyone wants to start a podcast. Everyone wants to start a radio show. But after week one, like, will you actually do it every week? And the same thing applies here. Like, if you have an idea and you've been talking to someone about your idea for a podcast for 3 years and you haven't started it yet, that's going to be a red flag for me. You know, I'm going to ask you all those questions before I consider working with you, because what I want is for my creators to be consistent so that they can succeed.
So the term network brings up a lot of things because there's lots of podcast networks out there. But what does it mean to be a part of a network with you?
So in the resource sharing space and community space, I think, you know, a community of people that you can share guest appearances with, depending on the podcast. If you're looking for someone, based on our network, we can probably find you someone through word of mouth and those networks that we already have, like as individuals, right? So that's one part of it. And then monetization, being able to play in the female space. I have one creator on my network. I'm very inspired by her story, and we can talk about that after, because she's telling a story about taking control of your life after domestic abuse. But she's part of the team that brought DSW to Canada, and a lot of her work surrounds the idea of the female consumer and how much power they actually have.
So DSW, that's the shoe warehouse, right? Yeah.
So
it's fun. I used to have to go to Florida to shop there.
Yeah.
But I kind of liked how I could just wander around and touch the shoes.
Okay, now you're sounding...
Try them on.
A little creepy now. He's got a shoe touching thing, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, the point I'm making though is that she specializes in the female consumer and branding and marketing to this person. Call it your target demo if we were talking about radio or podcasting. But what's been really interesting in thinking about how I'm going to monetize with this network is all these creators have one thing in common. They are coming from a certain mindset about being a woman in traditionally male-dominated spaces, and the spending power is usually women. So let's take advantage, right? I think the opportunities are endless. The podcast game in Canada is still in a very amateur state. I think you would agree. But I think, you know, in a few years from now, it's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, Canada's smaller. It's 1/10 the size of the U.S. It's the same size as California. It can be a little bit more conservative in the ad buying sense. You and I we've seen our programmatic ads, and our programmatic ads are very busy for anybody who downloads this in the US, and not so much if you download it in Canada. It's a little bit quieter. I get the affidavit reports on some podcasts that only get 20% US listening, but they're getting 80% of the programmatic revenue. Mm-hmm. So that's a disparity that's going on in Canada. It's just simply scale. Yeah. But if somebody has a podcast, it doesn't matter what country in the world they're in, you're willing to bring them on.
And because of how amateur the industry is here right now, I think it's an opportunity to experiment, to take risks, to see where things go, because we have time to learn the best practices and the things that are going to work and the things that are going to be so shitty that we never want to do them again. So, for example, right now, you know, I've been on my podcast working with an American organization that is the sponsorship answer to what I'm doing as a production house. And that's been really cool because they need inventory, and I am giving them my podcast just to try it out before I hook them up with some of my clients. But so far, it's a pretty interesting experience.
Let's talk about some of your favorite toys.
Ooh, okay.
Namely, the one you're using right now. What are you using for a microphone?
This Shure SM7B. God bless the man who bought it for me, who is no longer my partner, but I will always thank him for this.
All right. Hey, you won that in the divorce. Congratulations. Yeah. A Squadcaster Riverside.
Well, we're on Squadcast right now, and I will say that even my experience joining the studio now, you know, how many days has it been? About 1,000 days since I've joined you on Squadcast, and my interest is piqued to play around with this a little more. Riverside has been tried and true for me. I feel like I've been growing with that software, so the way that I use it, I'm just always like, oh, there's an update on this. Let me try that out. They've got lots of really cool, and I'm sure Squadcast has this too. You can maybe speak to some of those things in more detail, but a lot of the new AI tools are really cool. Generating show notes in the back end. It's not that you want to cut and paste them word for word, but like when you're just end of a long day and you got to put a podcast episode out, to be able to say, what do we talk about again? and use that as your starting point to craft some great show notes. I love that feature of Riverside. I also love the fact that there's always a backup of your recording. So, something I always say, don't leave the room yet, because you take a couple minutes to upload at the end, but there's a local backup recorded on everyone's computer. So if something gets lost or weird warbly sounds happen based on internet connection, there's something local that's going to upload after that. You can fix all that. So those are some of my favorites.
Yes, Squadcast has that. I think the AI stuff is residing over in Descript.
Yes.
So I was going to ask you about editing. So what do you like to edit with?
Adobe Audition. That's probably like a comfort thing. I have not ever done an edit with AI, although Riverside does have that option to like clean up ums and spaces and pauses and all that. I like the human touch on editing. I feel like you're the same.
I am. I was just going to ask you, though, you kind of killed my question. I was
Oh.
going to say, are you like one of those snobs who wants to like listen to it and use the audio? And the answer is yes. And I think that's totally fine.
Yeah, like could I be saving a touch more time? Probably. But here's another thing, and I don't know if you're like this with editing. I feel like people listen to podcasts while they're doing something. They're on a walk, they're cooking, they're, whatever it is. So because of that, if you want to let go a little bit over every little detail, a great way to edit is just to listen as you're doing something. And then when something catches your ear that you're like, ooh, got to fix that. That's when you go back to the recording and take out whatever you want, then continue listening. So it's almost like you're listening passively, but as the audience would.
You've launched with a splash. Tell me, who are some of the podcasters that you're working with in the network?
Okay. So a few weeks ago, some layoffs happened at Bell Media. And this forced a creator that I've been working with as a producer and a co-host for a year and a half to make a decision about their content and loyalty to the person that they had worked with for more years than my 1.5. And that person is Jann Arden. And the co-host is Caitlin Green. And they are now part of my network. And I am blown away at the decision that Jann made to support her friend and colleague, but also that she trusts me enough with her content to know that this will be a good move for her as an independent creator. So, I mean, to start that, like, what an honor. I don't even know what to say about that. I can't believe it. I cannot believe it.
So can you explain to those who might know about the importance of Jann Arden,
Yeah.
a household name in Canada?
But you're right. And it's funny. I'm teaching podcasting at Western right now, a podcasting course. And, when I did guest speaking for the class, you had to pass the prerequisite to get into mine. Also to like market the course a little bit because it's brand new. I'm like, show of hands. Who's heard of Jann Arden in the room? It's a bunch of, I think they're 19, 20, around there.
Gen Z.
Yeah. And I don't think anyone knew who she was. And I was like, okay, we're call her daddy. All the hands go up. So that was really telling very early on in my teaching journey. But anyway, so to any Americans that might be listening, Jann Arden is a household name in Canada. She is an iconic musician, huge hits from the 90s. She's also done television shows, screenwriting, and she does some comedy too. And she still tours. She's actually just on a tour with Rick Mercer for spring in Canada, where they're talking about all the things that they've done before. And yeah, so Jann is like a creator that I'm very proud to be connected with in this way.
And another podcast that you're working with, and I know this because it's disappeared from my stack.
Sorry.
That's all right. You and I were working on it together for the last 8 or 9
Yes.
months. And it's one that is called Trust Me, I'm a Decorator.
So Debbie Travis and Tommy Smythe. And yeah, just for people who are like, wait, what is going on with Matt and Sarah here in their business? So Matt is the podcast guy in Canada as far as I am concerned. You've got a lot of like big, call it corporate podcast situations or branded content networks. I think when we're just talking about independent podcasting, Matt is the guy. So kudos, first of all, for all your knowledge, first of all, of the industry, but also your education piece. I think you've been really educating a lot of creators in this space, including me, for what's to come with podcasting in Canada. So, we worked on a couple podcasts together over the last year. Donna Meros Through the Fire was another one. And, through Jann and her manager, Chris, who manages Tommy Smythe, I ended up having a conversation with Debbie and Tommy about their podcast. And at that point, I didn't have my network. I don't even think I realized I was going to do this 9 months ago. I think it was a seed that was planted, but it hadn't really like sprouted yet.
Well, what's the moment when you thought, I could do this? Because there's always one, and usually it's like over a drink in a bar, or maybe it's at a conference. Where's the moment where you say, okay, I'm going to do this?
It must have been in July or August, before Podcast Movement, because I remember saying the words out loud at Podcast Movement, the conference we went to in Denver for the first time. I'm going to start. Hi, I'm Sarah Burke, and I'm starting a women's podcasting network in Canada. And then after I said it out loud, I was like, oh, shit. I got to do it now. I have to do it.
Yeah. After the 2 free drinks at happy hour, off you go.
I was really more excited about the sliders, but anyway. Or no, it wasn't sliders. It was tacos. The party I liked was tacos. Anyway. So yeah, Debbie and Tommy, 2 television personalities who have a lot of other things going on in their lives, and they have built lots in their careers, but together they come together to do this podcast, a little tongue-in-cheek with the title, because they do talk decorating, but rarely. It's food, travel, life advice, relationships, all those things. Just to name another few creators on the network, Morehouse, the More Money podcast. She's a monster podcast without me. The fact that she joined the network, I'm, again, honored. Jessica is talking about financial literacy, and she especially loves educating women in the space to not be intimidated by financial conversations. We've got Beyond the Sale, which is a real estate podcast hosted by Cynthia Ostos. And again, there's a piece there where she's very interested in speaking to women who have fulfilling careers as well as personal lives. She's, a mom of 3, and the whole balancing act around that in a very how much work goes into real estate, and weird hours around the clock, all that kind of stuff. And who am I missing, Matt? You've seen my back end. That sounds weird.
I think you had a couple other you were talking to, but I wasn't quite sure if you'd signed them, so I didn't want to say anything at this point.
I'm trying to remember who else there is.
But you've named them. You've named all the ones that are currently residing
network.
on the network. Yeah.
Okay. So Ladies Take Control. That is hosted by Katie Maris, and so she has just come out of 4 years of abuse in so many ways. Her story is very inspiring. She's the DSW gal that we were talking about. Carlin Costa, who is a psychotherapist, a sexologist, and a cannabis educator. She's also certified for plant medicines in all sorts of psychotherapy situations. Her podcast revolves around body image and neurodivergence. She has ADHD, and she recently reversed a weight loss surgery from when she was a young girl that has led to her and her diagnosis. And as a psychotherapist, she's also pretty funny. So I'm very excited about that podcast. And then I have Lisa Laronde, who is the president of RSG International. It's a road safety and infrastructure company. And when my colleague first approached me about this podcast, I was like, what is this podcast going to be about? Well, it's women in leadership, but talk about playing in a male-dominated space. Lisa is a character. And oh my goodness, the first thing she says on her podcast when I'm recording with her is, my name's not on the building, so why the fuck am I here? I was like, okay. So anyway, all these women do have a thread in common, which I look for, which is amplifying women's voices and diversity and being very open-minded to seeing new perspectives, community, all those things.
So one of the best pieces of advice that I've ever gotten my whole life came from Matty Stott at Jam Street Media. He actually did a talk in 2021 in Nashville at Podcast Movement saying why you should not start a podcast network.
Okay.
And I blew right past that and went right to Podcast Network. And I work with a lot of podcasts. A lot of them don't have a lot to do with each other.
How many now, Matt? 70 something?
There's about 60.
Okay.
There's 60 some odd podcasts that I work with.
Look at you. Jeez.
Yeah. But again, a lot of them, some of them could have a little bit of a sports take, and some of them could have a lot of it's business. A lot of it is just, there's one real estate
wellness
in there
health.
As well. Many different, lots of wellness and health, but little different stacks. And the only reason I wanted to do a network was so that I could put promos in between, all the health and wellness and all the sports and pair it all together so that we could, cross promotion and to possibly get some programmatic money and some advertising options for creators. But this is a little different for you because yours, I could put women in media. Yeah, I get that. I know exactly what that is.
Yeah.
So here you're wandering through year one. What do you think is going to happen after the first year? Or what expectation might you have?
Honestly, I just incorporated my business. So I'm scared shitless right now. if I'm being honest. But I know that the people that I work with trust me, and the people that I've chosen to work with, I trust them. So that is what's going to carry it forward. You know, if the network grows, amazing. Monetization wise, I think you understood what I was saying about taking risks right now. Like, try something. If it doesn't work, well, you're not making money anyway. So whatever. And then you find a better way. I've come from working on a podcast like Jann's, which was associated with Bell Media, for example, and the way that they do things. And then I've got knowledge from how you do things. And just putting all those experiences together tells me that there is a better way to do some things that over here weren't working and are working over here. And that's why year one, I'm going to give myself grace to take a bunch of risks. I think that's what it's about, because if anything is going to carry this forward, it will be the creators.
When I'm asked to look ahead 1 year, I think to myself, okay, we can make whatever predictions we want, but there's a lot in podcasts we don't control. So a good example is the Apple Podcast iOS 17. Yeah, where it's kind of like, yeah, we've changed the way we're passing out the podcast and you're all getting 20% less downloads.
Well, maybe you want to explain that quickly in case someone's listening who has no idea what the hell you're talking about, because...
Yeah, so very simply, if you were listening to podcasts on Apple.
The little purple podcast app for my mother.
If you were using the purple app, what used to happen is, let's say you didn't listen to any of the last 4 episodes, Apple would pause that and stop downloading the show. No problem as of yet. But what would happen is when you came back and said, oh yeah, I do want to listen to that show again, and then you say follow, what it would do is it would download the entire back catalog that you missed. So that's like 17, 18, 20. I don't know how long you were away, and I don't know how many episodes that would be, but a lot of downloads would just go to your phone and you probably didn't listen to them. And by the way, ads would also be delivered, and that's not helpful. So there were some companies writing checks back to advertisers, in that period. So anyhow, Apple went and issued a correction. And from that, people are seeing about 20 to 30% less downloads, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on how big your back catalog is and how often you're releasing episodes. So I mentioned that because when you make a prediction, this is what's going to happen this year. I'm going to promise you this many downloads. I'm going to promise you this much money. And I think the year is going to go like this. It could be one little change that somebody makes along the way to really change it. So I asked you a prediction question, but in general, don't make too many predictions. But I did want to hear what you had to say. But I do feel sometimes it's like, hey, let's start a fire and see if we can't burn the whole thing down in the meantime.
Well, another great example of something that we have no control over, but is such a hot topic, is YouTube. Like, what will YouTube as a company do in the next 2 years? Like, who knows?
That's a good question. So you do a lot of audio. So how do you plan to manage video for your clients?
So a lot of them have specific requests to receive the video and do their own thing with it. For example, like Cynthia has a great team, this fellow Owen, who works for a company called Uplift Studios, his own company. So they're doing all the production on the video, and I'm like, great, because, I can't do that for 8 people. It's enough for me to keep up with that on my own podcast, the way we're recording right now on Squadcast. The way that I think video works is the easiest way that you can make it work. So right now, personally, when I'm going into a recording, I'm treating it like a live environment and putting up the file, cleaning up just the beginning and the tail at the end. And if I marked a timestamp where it was like, gotta take that out, that was inappropriate, or that was stupid, or whatever it is, or the guest was uncomfortable with something they said. Other than that, it's going up unedited. And I think one thing that you and I run into all the time is this idea that the audio edit can be the same as the video edit. I almost don't even want to go down that rabbit hole right now, but you have so much more opportunity to make great audio if you're keeping up with the right workflow. So that's, I think, the important part. Whereas like with video, because it's great to have it, but it's an audio first format, your audio's got to be great. And if you have video, even if you're not doing like the same intricate editing as audio, at least there is some video. That's the way I look at it.
Sarah, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast. But most of all, congratulations on the launch of the new network.
Was this because you were bored? You're just cutting me off at the video situation? We got to go now? I was like, wow, Matt, work on your transitions. Thank you for having me. Thank you for educating me and most of this industry in Canada and doing what you do too.
Thanks.
The Sound Off Podcast is written and hosted by Matt Cundill. Produced by Evan Serminski. Edited by Chloe Emo Lane. Social media by Aiden Glassy. Another great creation from the Sound Off Media Company. There's always more at soundoffpodcast.com.